In the mid-1940s, the emergence of democracy in Cuba, Venezuela, and Guatemala had galvanized pro-democracy activists all over Latin America. And in November of 1945, when Eduardo Latera, the foreign minister of Uruguay, proposed a resolution advocating for multilateral collective action in support of democracy and human rights, the resolution would not be supported by most of the hemisphere's governments, however would embolden political rebels. And the activities of a loosely knit group that would later be called the Caribbean Legion began in 1946. The dictatorships of Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic and of Somoza Garcia in Nicaragua were seen as particularly tyrannical at the time, and so became targets of the Caribbean Legion. Now, the Caribbean Legion itself never had a formal structure, and the name was coined by journalists in the United States in 1947. Although it had members from every country in Latin America, the greatest number came from the Dominican Republic, and many of which were exiles and veterans. Many of the Cubans and Dominicans had volunteered to fight in the U.S. Army during World War II, while others had fought in the Spanish Republican Army during the Civil War. There were also some pilots who had been members of the U.S. Air Force within the Legion. The funding and weapons of the Caribbean Legion came from many different sources, as a number of weapons dealers had stock left over from World War II that they were willing to sell to the Legion, who also received support from various times from governments of Cuba and Guatemala, as well as from Costa Rica, after Jose Figueres Ferrer came to power in 1948, and the biggest source of funding for the Legion would be Juan Rodriguez Garcia, a wealthy Dominican rancher who fled from the Dominican Republic in January of 1946. Also, as a fun fact, a member of the Caribbean Legion was Fidel Castro, who at this time was a freedom fighter for democracy and would participate in the Cayo Confites affair as a 21-year-old, and he would be captured with the rest of the invasion force, but he escaped by allegedly jumping off of the Cuban Navy vessel that he was on, and he swam ashore. Anyway, in the summer of 1947, a group of about 1,200 armed men were assembled in Cuba with the covert assistance of Cuban President Ramon Gar San Martin, who the military leaders of the group believed had their own strength and assistance of the Dominican underground, and they would then be able to overthrow the dictator Rafael Trujillo. Preparations of the force were not kept very secret, and its intent was very public. Fidel Castro was a lieutenant at this time as part of the group to overthrow the dictator. In September of 1947, the U.S. government pressured the Cubans into arresting the entire force, and the invasion never took place. The weapons of the forces were also confiscated, and the exiles were set free within several days. The incident would be given the name Cayo Confites Affair, after the area in Cuba from where the invasion was supposed to be launched. After the collapse of the Dominican invasion attempt, the Guatemalan government of Juan Jose Arevalo became the Legion's biggest supporter. Arevalo had previously gained weapons for the exiles by claiming that he was purchasing them for the Guatemalan military, and he would convince the Cuban government to release the Caribbean Legion and their weapons to the Guatemalan government, where the exiles began to congregate in Guatemala. In December of 1947, Arevalo convinced them to sign the Pacto del Caribe, or Caribbean Pact, which was a document which laid out a unified agenda for the exiles. The document explicitly called for the overthrow of the governments of Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. From 1948 to 1949, however, the United States would repeatedly ask Arevalo to withdraw his support for the Caribbean Legion, fearing that the Legion was supporting communist interests. However, although the Legion was anti-dictatorial and was opposed to anti-communist regimes, it was also opposed to communism. Historians would write that the Legion would likely have supported the United States against the Soviet Union, and that the Caribbean Pact explicitly stated that the Legion would ally itself with the United States for common defenses against communism. Costa Rican exile Jose Figueres would come into contact with the Caribbean Legion in 1947, following the Cayo Confites affair, where Figueres offered Costa Rica as a base of operations for the Legion against the government of Somoza in Nicaragua if the Legion would help him overthrow Teodoro Picado, who was the incumbent dictator. And although the government of Picado was engaged in limited social reform within the country, it did not wish to engage with anti-dictatorial efforts in Central America, so many of the exiles were opposed to it. Costa Rica was also an attractive base because, like I said, it borders Nicaragua, whereas Guatemala did not. Arevalo agreed to Figueres' offer and provided the exiles with the confiscated weapons that he had received from Cuba, and on January 1st, 1948, the Costa Rican government had annulled a presidential election that had been won by the opposition candidate. This provided the Legion with a justification for an invasion, and the 300-strong Costa Rican army was quickly defeated by the Caribbean Legion, which had been mostly composed of Nicaraguan exiles, and Figueres was made president until the democratically elected winner of the nullified election was restored. In 1949, Arevalo supported another invasion of the Dominican Republic, this time by the air, where 60 Dominican exiles were to take part. The invasion force was trained at Guatemalan military facilities, and Arevalo persuaded the Mexican government to even allow the invasion planes to refuel there. However, due to poor coordination and poor weather, only 15 men of the invasion force landed in the Dominican Republic, where they were quickly captured or killed. The trial of those who were captured was used by the Trujillo government to express its support for non-interventionism and to condemn the Guatemalan government as a puppet of the Soviet Union. The United States would also strongly criticize the Legion following the capture of its fighters. The failure of the invasion would lead to the collapse of the Legion, as it never fought another battle after this. And that is the short story of the Caribbean Legion and their actions in Latin America in the immediate aftermath of World War II. What other aspects of the Cold War would you like for me to cover? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.